One of the big challenges with fatigue management is that many people don't actually consider fatigue to be a major risk to them. This is not dissimilar to the way that communities have responded to drugs and alcohol and seatbelts, for example, over the last 20 to 30 years. That is, it takes a while for the community to identify, appreciate, and respond to the risks associated with any particular hazard. And fatigue is no different to that. One of the things that we know when we ask people to rank their level of concern about a particular hazard in the workplace is that fatigue rarely comes up as a major safety hazard for organisations. And that's not surprising. Many times people have operated fatigued and not had an accident. We know that fatigue-related accidents and injuries are relatively low frequency. And for many people, until they actually have an accident, it can be the case that they go, well, I've been this fatigued many times before and it's never caused a problem. So in one sense, their response to underrate fatigue as a hazard based on its likelihood alone can be quite rational. On the other hand, the consequences, even though they don't happen very often, can be catastrophic. In this section of the course, I'd like to talk to you about some of the research that we've been doing over the last couple of years, and in particular how we have gone about convincing people within organisations that fatigue is of concern and that it is actually a significant hazard within the workplace. To give you some background on this, I'd like to tell you a story about some work that we did up at Port Augusta, which is in the north of South Australia, at one of the power stations up there in the mid to late 90s. We were working up there and we were sitting around the table doing a safety share in which people were talking about experiences of fatigue at a personal level. And one of the old union delegates got up at the time and said, you know, Drew, driving home after night shift's a bit like driving home from the pub pissed on a Friday night. That is, I remember getting in the car and I remember waking up after my sleep, but I don't remember a lot about what went on the way through the course. And this was actually quite an interesting moment in the conversation because everybody started nodding their heads and going, yeah, I get that. I've driven home from work after night shift and not remembered much about it. And it struck me at the time that this was actually a really important moment. That is, for those people at that point in time, they saw the connection that the effects of fatigue were not dissimilar to the effects of alcohol intoxication. And that really struck me at the time because it made me realise how important it was to benchmark a hazard against something that other people consider a hazard. And one of the things that we've noticed in workplaces over the last 20 or 30 years is that 20 or 30 years ago, certainly when I was first starting in the workplace, drink driving was considered funny. And then over a period of 20 to 30 years, it's now reached the point where we no longer go out for a late lunch, and if you come home sober in the afternoon, it's not been a good day at work, to a point where in many workplaces alcohol is forbidden, or if you do drink, don't come back to work. And with respect to illegal drugs, that in many workplaces people are regularly tested for the presence of those drugs in order to ensure that they're not operating under the influence of drugs and alcohol. While fatigue hasn't reached that point yet, one of the things that's really important to get people to understand a new hazard is to provide a benchmark in terms of a well-accepted hazard. And one of the things that came from that story with the union delegate was how quickly people started nodding their head and acknowledging the importance of fatigue when it was expressed in terms of its similarity to alcohol intoxication. And at the time, we thought about this, and as a consequence, we undertook a series of studies. The next slide will show you how those studies are actually designed. And there have been probably about 8 to 10 papers published out of this research by ourselves, and this research has been replicated at last count by over 20 groups around the world. But the idea behind the research was extremely simple. That is, can we take the effects of fatigue and express them as a blood alcohol intoxication equivalent? And as you can see, and the slide that you can see now will enable you to see the basic experimental protocol that people were required to undertake. If you look at the diagram, you'll see that people are required to come into the lab on 3 separate occasions a control condition or a placebo condition, an alcohol condition, and then lastly a sleep deprivation condition. For the people coming into the protocol, they would come in, as you can see from the particular diagram that you have there, that people would come in and they would have a good night's sleep between 11 and 7, get up in the morning, and then in the alcohol condition, from 8 o'clock in the morning, they would drink 2 standard drinks every hour until their blood alcohol concentration reached a peak level of over 0.1%. In the placebo condition, people thought they were getting alcohol, but in actual fact, what we did was to rub alcohol around the rim of the glass, fill it up with the mixer, which in this case was either orange juice, iced coffee, or cranberry juice, and then people were in the protocol where 2 of the people in the lab at the time were drinking alcohol and 2 of the people were drinking the placebo. Now, one of the problems with placebo conditions that affect you at a psychological level is that people eventually realise that they're out of it. And this study was actually no different. Up until a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05, most people couldn't tell which condition they were in because of the contact high of being around some people who are drinking and some people who are not. On the other hand, by the time people got to a 0.1% blood alcohol concentration, everybody understood the difference. But by subtracting the effects of alcohol from the placebo condition, then that enabled us to see what the effects of alcohol were independent of the psychological effects of the drug. The third condition that people undertook was to come into the lab, and then, as with the other conditions, they had a sleep from 11 till 7, got up, and then started a protocol that went through from 8 o'clock in the morning for 30 hours. That may seem an extremely long period of time, but in practice, that's about the maximum amount of wakefulness you'll see in a shift worker in the Australian population. That is, they will get up after a series of day shifts in the morning and will typically be awake until they get home from work the following day. And in some cases, a certain proportion of the population will stay up until 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon in order to go to sleep and then get up and go to work. So by keeping people awake for 30 hours, we could see the maximum amount of fatigue that you would typically see in an Australian workplace. In fact, if you look at the Australian Bureau of Census and Statistics results, they will show you that 95% of shift workers on the first night of night shift will be awake from somewhere between 17 and 30 hours. The second part that's important to think about in this protocol is what we actually measured as an indicator of performance and therefore performance impairment. What you will see in terms of the subsequent studies is that we have done a lot of research in this area, but broadly speaking, you can divide the measures up into 2 broad categories. We did a whole bunch of what we refer to as button pushing tests in the lab. These are typical tests used by experimental or research psychologists that involve people to look at something on a computer screen, push a button, and we vary the complexity of the task and measure how many times you get the task right or wrong, that is the proportion correct, and the time it takes you to actually respond. And in broad terms, as people become increasingly fatigued, their error rate goes up and their processing time goes down. The second set of studies that we undertook were involved using simulators. So we put people into all sorts of simulators to see whether the effects that we initially looked at in terms of lab-based performance measures actually translated into real-world tasks. Obviously, we couldn't take people out onto the road or onto the train or into the aeroplane under the influence of alcohol, but by using a simulator we could see whether the comparative effects of alcohol and fatigue actually translated into real-world tasks. The next slide shows you the results from those studies, and what I've tried to do is to summarise the key findings from that group of research studies. Interestingly, irrespective of whether we compare the effects on the button pushing tests done in the lab or whether we use the simulator results, we saw much the same outcome. That is, and as you can see from the graph, time of day is on the x-axis at the bottom, and performance relative to 8 o'clock in the morning at the start of the study is on the y-axis. So you can see at the start of the study, most people's performance starts off at around about 100%, as it should, because we baseline it there, and then it improves slowly across the day, reaching a peak at around about 7 or 8 o'clock at night. Then it rapidly declines as people approach the normal sleep onset period, reaching a low point at around about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and then it starts to raise up again. You'll also see that there are two dotted red lines on the graph, one which represents the 0.05% equivalency, and you can see there that people's performance was typically around about 60 to 70%. That means is if we compare somebody at 0.05, their performance was 30% poorer than it typically would be at 8 o'clock in the morning. And you'll see from the 0.1% blood alcohol equivalency that people's performance was just under 50% of what it would be at around about the 0.1% level. If you look at that graph, you can see that by around about 2 o'clock in the morning, having woken up at 7 o'clock the previous morning, that an individual's performance has declined to the equivalent that it would be at a 0.05% blood alcohol concentration, and that by 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning, people's performance on average is worse than it would be at a 0.1% blood alcohol concentration. This raises a number of interesting points. If it's not okay to be at work under the influence of alcohol at the 0.05% and certainly not at the 0.1%, why is it that as organisations we're quite happy for people to be there with the same level of impairment due to a different drug, so to speak, in this case fatigue? One of the interesting things about this research is when you present it to people, it actually makes them stop and think about the relative or comparative risks associated with fatigue. I think this graph on its own has done more to change senior management minds over the last 10 or 15 years than just about anything that we've done in the area of fatigue risk management. One of the key points that we think you need to emphasise to organisations in order to get them to take fatigue seriously is to understand the comparative risk associated with fatigue. In the original Nature paper, we put this in a very polite language, which was to say this provides an easily grasped index of the comparative or relative risk associated with fatigue. And I think this is a really key point for you to understand in this course. The risks associated with fatigue in terms of the likelihood of error are not dissimilar to the effects that you would see at the 0.05 to 0.1% blood alcohol concentration. And I think that leads to some interesting discussions within organisations. If it's not okay to be under the influence of alcohol, why is it okay to be at work under the influence of fatigue? And why, in many organisations, not only do we say it's okay to be there, but in many cases we'll pay you a premium. And if you think about that from an occupational health and safety perspective, paying people a premium to assume a risk is actually what we used to call danger money, and as many of you will know as occupational health and safety professionals, is that danger money is actually illegal. So this leads to an interesting paradox in organisations to think about when they consider the relative risks associated with fatigue. Some of you will have noticed that the curve looking at the relationship between performance across time is actually not a straight line. It is actually a curvilinear line. And as many of you will know, there isn't a simple linear relationship between hours of work and the level of impairment and, for that matter, the blood alcohol equivalent. This is an important point to understand and one that's often overlooked and simplified. In many organisations, there is an implicit assumption that the link between how many hours you work and how fatigued and therefore how impaired you are is a simple linear one. So if you work 8 hours, 12 hours, 16 hours, then the risk goes up in a constant monotonic relationship. But that's not actually the case. In the next section of the presentation, what we'd like to talk about is the key factors that drive the biology of fatigue and why you can see on this graph that raise or increase in performance in the last part of the study. Those of you who have been shift workers will clearly understand what's been referred to in common parlance as the sun-up effect. That is, even though I continue to stay awake, I feel better at lunchtime than I did at 6 o'clock the previous morning, even though I still haven't had a sleep. And one of the key elements to understanding fatigue is to understand the biology of fatigue. The next slide shows you some data taken from a study in which people were kept awake for nearly 100 hours. That may sound like torture, and I think for many of the subjects in that particular experiment, it probably felt like torture by the time they'd been up for nearly 100 hours. But what you can see is the way that those two drivers of fatigue, that is the daily variation in the body clock or circadian system and prior wakefulness work together. So you can see across the day that fatigue goes up and down, but in the long term, over the 4 days, that there is a long-term trend. So you will see fatigue go down and up and down and up and down and up and down across the 4 days of the study. By the time the individual reaches the end of the study, it's certainly much lower, even at the most alert time of the day, than it had been at the start of the study. But conversely, you can see that there are certain points where you can stay awake longer but be more alert than you were at a previous point, particularly where you are at the low point in the body clock. There's been a lot of research done over the last 20 or 30 years in terms of how time awake and time of day interact to affect fatigue. And if you look at the consensus values that come out of the research over the last few years, then most people will say about half the system is driven by how long you've been awake, and about half of it is driven by the circadian or biological clock. So this creates a number of very important outcomes for managing fatigue out in the real world. The first is that most of our enterprise agreements and most of our regulations around fatigue are based on the simple assumption that the more fatigued you are, the longer you've been at work, or vice versa, the longer you've been at work, the more fatigued you are. But in actual fact, if you think of the graph that we showed you previously, somebody was at their maximum level of fatigue at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. And as a result of that, extended wakefulness, by the time they got to 12 o'clock in the afternoon, they're actually much more alert. This carries some very practical implications. So for example, if I was to extend a shift from midnight till 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, fatigue would go up very significantly because it would reflect the combined effect for being awake longer and reaching the low point in the body clock. On the other hand, if I finished a night shift and extend the shift until lunchtime, actually, even though the shift is longer, that person's level of fatigue will not necessarily go up. This complex interaction between time of day and time awake carries significant consequences in terms of how you would actually manage fatigue in the workplace and how you think about the different shift patterns and the options for extending overtime that may happen in your particular workplace. We'll go into this in a lot more detail, and most importantly, there are now quite sophisticated software programs that enable you to model these phenomena without having to think about it all in your own head. But nevertheless, it's important to understand that it's not a simple linear relationship. This combination of effects, that is time awake and time of day, carries some significant implications for you to think about in terms of your workforce. If we look back at the history of how we have regulated working hours, then if we go back to the original Factory Acts that started in the late 19th century, then you will see that these were based primarily around protecting people from physical fatigue. If we go back and look at the literature on physical fatigue, then you will see that time awake and time at work are a very good indicator of the likely level of physical fatigue. So if you go back to those early 20th century regulations and union agreements around labour, then you'll see that people are typically limited in terms of the number of days they can work in a row and the number of hours that they can work in any particular shift. From a strictly scientific level, managing physical fatigue by regulating the number of hours in a day, the number of days in a week, and the timing of breaks within the shift is actually a very effective control. Physical fatigue accumulates as a linear function of time worked, and recovery occurs as a linear function of time away from the task. However, in the last 50 years, we've seen that the level of physical activity in most jobs has declined markedly, and the requirements for mental activity in those tasks has gone up significantly. And here lies one of the fundamental problems. While we have a 100-year history of managing fatigue, and traditionally physical fatigue by limiting the length of the shift and the number of shifts in a week, and that's been a very effective measurement, a very effective tool for managing fatigue, it turns out to not be a particularly effective way of managing the mental fatigue associated with the job. The reason for this goes back to that time of day effect we saw in the graph. And as tasks become increasingly cognitive, then time of day effects become increasingly important in the assessment of the level of risk associated with a particular work pattern. The challenge of this didn't really emerge till after the Second World War, when people used to work really long hours sitting in a cockpit, and we started to see the effects of fatigue on mental performance vary as a function of time of day. The difficulty we have now is that we have an 80-year history of regulation based around limiting shift duration and break durations. The difficulty, however, they're only half of the equation. The challenge in the next 20 years is going to be, how do we incorporate the effects of time of day in ways that enable us to regulate effectively without producing significant negative effects on productivity?